Hi, everyone. We are LUMAN. I'm Maya Zuckerman, and this is my dear co-partner with Tirza and myself in LUMAN. Hi, Philip.
Hello, hello, welcome.
How are you doing today?
Excellent. It's a beautiful, wonderful summer day in Germany. So I'm always happy
You're
when
in
it's warm
Berlin.
here. I'm in Berlin at the moment, yes.
That's great. That's great. So do you want to kind of frame us on what we're going to be discussing today?
Sure. I think we're going to talk about how it's really easy to feel disconnected in today's world, and it's become a very overwhelming place. And this idea of belonging is really at the heart of who we want to be as humans. I think one of the key aspects that makes us healthy and feeling like we're in the right place and feeling like we're here with meaning is that we have a sense of belonging. And today's world is making it really difficult to have that sense. But if you think about our ancestors who lived in the same village or the same little place, they knew every single leaf of grass, they knew every single tree that they walked by every day, and they had a natural way of belonging to the environment. Right? And even I grew up in a small town, and around there were people that had never left their little town of like 1,500 people. And it was very clear that they belonged there because that's all they knew, and that's all and they knew every little house and every little street and every little path and down to the blades of grass, knew where they were and knew where they belonged. And I myself struggled with that all my life, because I grew up in that small town and I didn't feel like I belonged. And I left there as quickly as I could and went out into the big wide world and traveled around the world and lived in 3 continents and lived and worked in 20 something countries and always seeking this sense of belonging. And I had that fortunately to some extent with my family. Even if I was far away, even 20 years ago, there was Skype and things to be in connection. So there was some sense of having a foundation at least, but it was really hard to figure out, like, where do I belong? Where am I supposed to be? And I realized that space in today's world is not necessarily what gives you belonging anymore. Like, if you think about how the average person moves around quite a bit for jobs and sometimes even across continents or across countries. And so this default belonging is falling away. Right? And if you think about default belonging, it's usually like a space or family and genetics, right? We can identify with that as a sense of belonging, but many people that I've talked to over the years lost that. Some of them had crappy families and they didn't feel like they belonged there. Some of them, were moving around, and a lot of my friends are expats, so they struggled with that belonging to a place as well. And so that kind of as a default, not to say that it can't be a source of belonging, but kind of as a default kind of fell away in this last century. And then if you think about that next level of belonging, oftentimes we find it in romantic partnerships, right? But if you think about couples that say that they belong to each other, that's oftentimes a recipe for codependence, right? Versus an actual partnership, right? Where you have two individuals that are choosing to be together and have some agreement space around being together versus just defaulting to each other all the time, right? So even that, and from my own experience, I can say that, my divorce was very, painful at the time. When I got married, I thought, oh, here's where I belong. And then I realized that's also not a sustainable source of belonging either, right? And in this world of swiping left, swiping right, doing that kind of stuff, that's also not a consistent source of belonging. So also that's not something where we can find ourselves, right? And then if you think about the next level of sort of intellectual belonging, in the sense of belonging to a belief system, right? When you only have one and that's the only one you're available to you, it's easy to belong to that and identify with that. But in today's world, obviously, we have a flood of information and a flood of ideas and a flood of belief systems. And even there, the default is falling away as well, because we're seeing other belief systems that weren't accessible to us before. And we might like pieces of one and we might like pieces of another, but again, not necessarily a sustainable source of belonging either. And so what I did find is that the real, like for me at least, what helped me a lot was just understand that this sense of community, of belonging to a community, comes from actually adding value to other people's lives. Right? If I'm creating value for someone, even if they don't know it, but if I'm creating value for someone, I'm giving myself fully to some relationship, that creates a sense of belonging, right? And that's sustainable because I can do that anytime I want to, right? And every relationship is in a way an invitation to create a sense of belonging. right? Even if it's as simple as going to buy yourself a lunch sandwich, even then, you know, I mean, it's already like how I'm interacting in that situation, right? Like, for example, I have this little baker around the corner from me, and it's my baker, right? And I go there and I know the people who work there, and it feels fun to go there, and I have a fun interaction with them every time I go. And when I leave with my piece of bread, I feel like I belong here, right? And we belong together. So having a value exchange and having that is a really sustainable source of belonging. And that comes into who we become in every moment, right? And really the invitation for interacting and relating to other people.
Yeah, and I'd like to, before I move into becoming, which is a very important topic as well, is just to kind of frame a little bit of what you just discussed, which is the relationship, the reciprocity. And that is true to everything we do, including in the business world, how we are with our teams, how we are with our vendors, how we are in the supply chain. And the conversation of right relationship and sacred reciprocity actually comes from indigenous conversations, but it is something that needs to actually be looked at as we move from kind of the great pause and great reset that we're in right now to how do we build back better, to borrow from the American Democratic nominee Joe Biden's campaign, but it's something that's been around for a very long time. That is part of the conversation, that like, who do we belong to, and can we actually create more emphasis on the healthier relationships, and again, bring into the business world, it's how we are with our team, how we are with our leaders within the team, how the leaders are relating to the rest of the team, how they're relating to their multi-stakeholders, is actually a lot of the work that needs to be done in order for us to build a more equitable, just, better world, and also to be able to tackle the biggest challenges that are coming in front of us, which, you know, COVID is a very small beginning of it. But here, sitting in California, being bombarded with smoke from every direction, very, very, very present to me right now. The crisis of our climate changing on such a rapid speed.
And thanks for bringing it back to the global situation again, right? Because really, I think what also happened in the last century is we stretched that spectrum, right? Before, belonging, the smallest unit was family, which is why still your family name is more important than your first name. But then we've had these individuals, you know, from artists that have lived that, from Cher and Prince and all these artists that had one names, right? So they've been showing here as an individual. So we stretch that spectrum to that end, and we stretch it on the other end where we've gone beyond globalization, right? Because globalization was still sort of this flatland metaphor of conquering the surface. And COVID has actually shown us, and this is one of the unfortunate things that have happened with it, is that people have actually had this exposure to world maps all the time. So in some ways, they've gotten this overview effect, right, of really seeing, oh shit, this world is connected. And what happens in Beijing doesn't matter in Berlin, and doesn't matter in Bangalore, and doesn't matter in Boston, and we're all connected, right? And I think the big question now is, how can we integrate on a planetary scale, right, and really become humanity on a planet, right? And this is really that both and, right, where in order to have experience, you need separation, right? Because if I wasn't separate, I wouldn't be experiencing this moment right now. So it's a default that that's true, that we're separate from each other, and we're also part of one whole thing, right? If I look from above, there's one planet Earth with one human species, and an alien would be very confused by us having nations and by us having states and by us having, you know, this finger pointing at each other around this planet, because they'd be like, dude, you all live on one planet. What's your problem? Right? And I think this is our opportunity to really become a planetary species now, which is our the big invitation here.
It's a big invitation, and it's where we belong. We all belong to this planet. It's great that you brought in the overview effect, which is the spiritual actual effect that astronauts get when they actually look at the Earth for the first time from the outside in. And it was coined in I think it was past the Apollo 17 astronaut Edgar Mitchell, and actually was mentioned in the Democratic Convention last night. Again, connection to that. So when we actually start speaking on that, and it's not a kind of only spiritual conversation, but actually a real conversation that is on the mainstream, things start changing, because then we realize that we are actually belonging to this planet and we're in this together. One of the really beautiful metaphors that I heard during COVID, because people are saying, oh, we're in the same boat. And it's not completely true. We're in the same storm, and we each are dealing with it in a different level, with the different mechanics of a different boat. And when we actually remember and actually start looking into that, we can actually see that this is where the work needs to happen. How do we actually lift up all the boats in the same way and weather the storm together? But let's jump into the conversation of becoming, because once we actually know who we belong to and that we belong to this bigger planet, but also moving back into the company, because I think there is also conversation like in business, are we belonging to the same team in a business? Are we belonging to the same company? Like, how are we aligned with that purpose of the company? Then moving from where we were, and my husband and I joke about anything before March is the before 4 times, and where we are right now, there's a question of, for us to actually build back better, who are we becoming? And I'm actually looking at it from a very deep conversation, but also from a business conversation, and it's part of the also conversation that the World Economic Forum has brought of the Great Reset. But if we're going to be resetting, we also have to understand who are we becoming. And there is a possibility that we are becoming extinct. I mean, this is a deeper conversation for just business, but also seeing the business world right now, so many small businesses are becoming extinct. I mean, I'm seeing it all over San Francisco. And that's a possibility. And not in a possibility that is actually happening, and how we're actually working together to not become extinct, but actually become something better. So we have both of those truths. Some of these businesses are going to become extinct. Some of our humanity is going to become extinct. But in that conversation of first connecting to who do we belong to, and then to who do we become and who do we get to be. And that's kind of where we're going to end up this conversation today. So in the conversation of what can I as a leader do? What can we as a collaborative, collective, business, tribe, neighborhood, city do? Who can we become together? And can we actually do something better? And I'm seeing that show up. I did mention the World Economic Forum. One of their sub projects is looking at global mobility, the new Global Mobility Coalition, which I'm an advisor to. And one of the things that I've noticed in just deep research is that cities, as organizations, as complex systems that they are working together to become something better. They're working to become more human. They're working to become more equitable. They're working to listen and become more inclusive of all their citizenry. Even in the conversation of open streets, which are the when cities block certain streets to actually slow the traffic and let people use it, there is even a conversation of is this only working for certain neighborhoods, and some neighborhoods are not safe enough to come outside. So there is even this deeper conversation of who are we becoming as a society, who are we becoming as companies. Companies are also looking at, why are we doing what we're doing? They're asking the deep questions. Are we just, selling more products, or are we becoming more of a company that really listens to their clients and their clients' needs and becomes more of a listening company, and also a company that thinks about 7th generation, not just the bottom line, and how we actually are looking at a circular donut economy and not only what is here in the next 3 months. So there's a lot of these conversation of, and it's a very deep conversation of, who are we becoming as a society? Who are we becoming as humans? Who are we becoming as cities and companies and other stakeholders? So we've been actually having this deeper conversation of like, where is this leading us to?
And really, where do we want to go? I think that's really the important question that I don't hear enough, honestly.
Yeah.
I hear a lot of reacting to things like, oh, here's AI, here's climate, here's COVID, here's things, and where is this going to lead us to, right? But that's already a reactive stance. That's already saying, oh, these things are happening, and now we need to react to it, right? And yes, on the one hand, we do need to have a response to these items, and they're all real, and they're all true, and they're all there. And the question is, who do you want to become, right? And where do we want to go? Right? It's, I mean, I lived in Hollywood for many years, and I always ask people if they knew one movie that portrayed a positive human future. And outside of Star Trek and the Jetsons, I didn't get very much. Right? Most of our future visions right now are dystopian in nature. Right? We have all kinds of ways of how we can imagine our extinction and how we could go extinct. And it's easy for us to imagine that, right? Because we're all taught as little kids to worry. Right? Worry about this, make sure you put your gloves on when you go outside, make sure you do this when you go outside, and put your helmet on when you go ride a bike, and all these things. We're taught to worry all the time. And rarely are we ever invited to imagine, rarely ever invited to say, hey, and what could the world look like? Right? What would we want? Right? If we have that understanding that we belong to a species, and we have that overview effect enough to know that there is only a spaceship Earth, and right now our spaceship is on fire, right? It's not just a house is on fire and we can go outside. We have a spaceship that's on fire, and outside of that is a lot of dark vacuum that will kill us all. That's a very different conversation. So once I have that understanding that I belong to this planet, then what would I want to see? Right? How would I want to see this? And I think a big piece of that is overcoming all the dualistic thinking of us and them, right? Whether it's individual parties, whether it's individual nations, whether it's individual organizations, right? Because even organizations, it's just a means of organizing ourselves. Right? We take these things for granted. A couple hundred years ago, there was no corporations. Right? There was different ways of organizing ourselves that have always existed. And we're now invited to organize ourselves anew. But it's not just the small companies that are going extinct, it's a lot of large ones too. If you look at the S&P 500, how many companies were there in 2000 that are no longer here? Right? And now we have these new infrastructure businesses that replace the steel and oil, or added to the steel and oil in the infrastructure businesses that are creating a global village. Right? If you look at Facebook, has more than most users than most nations have. So there is already a community, and within that, there's these stupid little filter bubbles. Right? And you're only seeing the things that are agreeing with you. Right? And this is something we get to overcome. And really what we need to overcome that is something that's bigger than ourselves, that's motivating, that's inspiring, that's exciting, to say, hey, look at this, we could build this kind of world. Right? And so this, I think each of us are invited to think about who we would want to become as individuals, as organizations, as businesses, as the world, right? As humanity even.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'd like to kind of talk a little bit more about Dystopian Utopia, because it's some of my favorite subjects. And yes, there's a lot we can learn from dystopian futures, because those are learning lessons, not a guidebook, as the memes about 1984 are often reminding us. So there's a lot we can actually learn from speculative futures. But I agree with you that who do we become and who do we get to actually do, who do we work together towards that becoming, is really, really, really important. And I think the issue that we have with utopia, and I think that's why utopia as are harder, is from its even etymology, it's the no place. It does not exist. So I bring in my writing and in my science fiction writing, and also in my language more and more, is topia, which is the place. And how do we actually create a place where we become better, we belong, and who we are, who we want to be, and what we want to create. So, and that is a kind of what they used to call the royal we. It's all of us coming together and finding that place together. And it's attainable because it's not perfect. It's got the rigidity of the issues. Not everything is solved, but it's better than where we are right now. And we have pathways in business right now, and we have pathways in infrastructure, et cetera, that can actually build towards that. You know, some of them are renewable energy. What I'm seeing in cities is multimodal and mobility as a service, and mobility hubs, and changing streets to, and it's things that are happening everywhere in the world. It's quite fascinating. Changing streets really quickly to be more like parks. So we have this in San Francisco, that almost every restaurant that can just build a little parklet outside and took over a parking spot. So, I mean, and it happened in 3-4 months. This is not years. This has happened overnight. So we have those capabilities to actually move towards the future that we want. But I agree with you. We need to actually make a collective decision or work within an alignment. And that's a lot of, what LUMAN also does, is like help people move towards that future that they want to build, be able to sit in the now and look towards the future and actually get excited about it, because that's not easy. And some of the reasons is not only because how we're taught, but I think we're dealing with a 21st century with 150,000-year-old operating system. So there is a lot of our conditioning that we need to unlearn, and it's not an easy process, but we can do it. And we start small by imagining what the world looks like in 5 years. But to do that, even in a way that can manifest a positive world and a worldview and a business view, we first have to ask, who are we and who do we be? And how can we actually be that person that can actually see that world? And it's actually coming back to the personal accountability, our personal regulation, all of the conversation around the self and who I would be. Do you want to speak more about that, Philip?
I think that you hit it right there. I mean, it's exactly that point of like, it is a collective journey of humanity, and a collection is made up of individuals, right? And in this case, it's really, if a certain amount of individuals behave a certain way, eventually the rest of the system will follow. Right? We have the innovation curve. We know that any system, if you have 8 to 10% around that, flips into a newer way of operating, the rest of the society actually follows, right? And I think you mentioned a whole lot of beautiful technology that is enabling that, right? And technology is always a result of our consciousness, right? And informs our consciousness, right? Aristotle already talked about that reciprocal function between our epistemology and our technology and how they inform each other. And we have new technology now that was built mostly from a different level of consciousness, right? If you think about the internet, was built as a result of all the personal development, all the explorations into how we can play around with our consciousness that happened in the 60s and 70s that created that technology. And now we have this technology, and now it's changing consciousness, right? Because today I can see what's going on in Bangladesh, and I can see what's going on in Brazil, and we can see each other. Right. And so this collective journey is forming and is informed by how each individual shows up. Right. And really, this is also the invitation for each of us to say, cool, it's okay that we're all hypocrites. Right. If you live in today's world, there are no equal saints and there are no equal sinners. Right. That's a spectrum. And depending on the day and depending on the moment and depending on the choice we make in every moment, we are somewhere on that spectrum. Right, and we're all, the technology we're using right now to have this conversation is unsustainable. Right, it's plastic, it's all kinds of precious metals that are drawn from the earth of child soldiers. I mean, there's all kinds of horrible karma that goes into even the technology we're using. And what are we using it for? Right, am I using it to perpetuate the system and perpetuate this old operating system? Unfortunately, I would, maybe disagree that it's not 150,000 years old, but maybe a couple of 100 years old, even, or 100 years old in terms of how we're operating today. And that's actually the good news, right? We've changed how we interact as humans again and again, and it's always been individuals who started that change, right? And each one of us is invited, and I know I'm inviting myself to that every morning to say, who do I want to be today? Right? How do I want to show up today? What kind of contribution can I make to the world today? How can I make sure that my system is aligned, right? That my physical system, my body, my emotional system, my thoughts and feelings are all pushing towards creating the kind of future that I would want to live in, and I would wish for everybody else to also live in, with the understanding that I'm totally wrong and I only have my perception, and I have to also, and this is kind of the video I posted the other day about diversity, right? It starts with acknowledging that none of us have an answer. None of us really knows what's going on. I seem to be here right now. I seem to be experiencing this. I seem to have all kinds of ideas of what I'm perceiving, and to know that I'm just a node in this human system. I'm just part of life, and I have a very limited view. Right? I can only see what I'm seeing, and you can see what you're seeing, and everybody here can see what they're seeing. And each one of us is bringing this beautiful gift of unique individuality to the table so that we can have a collective journey, so that we can move together. But it always starts with, who am I and how am I showing up, right? In every one of those opportunities that I have every day to be a better human, in quotation marks, whatever that might mean to me. Right? And this is that from, utopia and dystopia to polytopia to utopia, right? To really understand that there's a whole bunch of worlds, and we're not building a future, we're building futures in the midst of extinction, because the reality is many of our current systems will fall away and are falling apart. Our colleague Margaret Whitley talks about that beautifully, and how she's describing that the best thing we can do right now is build these oases of sanity, right? In my field, in my environment, what can I do here? What can I do in every day, in every one interaction that I have, in every email that I write, in every connection that I make with another human being. How am I showing up there? And if I'm changing that, if I'm changing my own perception around the world, and I'm holding myself to this big vision of who we could be as humanity, then I have some sort of guidance and some light at the end of the tunnel. Because it's easy to look around right now and be really, really, pessimistic, and it's just an easy perception. Right? There's so many things that can go wrong, and so many things that are going wrong, from pollution and different, trends. And I just looked at some graphs from limits to growth from the 1970s, right? And really, we haven't really done much in terms of making that any better, right? So what can each of us do every day to change that, right? And who do you get to be every day to change that?
Yeah, the personal and collective responsibility of taking ownership of what we've done as a human species, and really making a choice. What kind of characters do we want to be in the kind of the planetary Earth future? Or we want to be the destroyers or the stewards? And it really is like the kind of changing of our identities around who we want to be. So this was a wonderful conversation. Do you have anything else we want to close with before I close this for today?
Only, thank you for being here. Thank you for being Planet Earth, and please do what you can to, create life, and create more life.
Exactly. Yeah, and just kind of a quick question for whoever is listening to us today. We're going to be trying to do this every week. So how are you addressing connection and belonging in your organization, in your community? You can send us an email. It's connect@luman.io. We'll post it in our comments. And if you got any value out of today's talk, if you could just send us a little comment and like our page, and we'll be here next week. So thank you, everyone.